The Murder That Shook Pine Haven, a 1935 mystery. In the winter of 1935, the small town of Pine Haven, Wisconsin, stood as a testament to America's lumber industry. Steam rising from the mill's chimneys painted pictures against the cold January sky, while the steady rhythm of saw blades echoed through the valley. But beneath the surface of this hard-working community, tensions were building. The Great Depression had taken its toll, and Pine Haven was a town divided, not just by the railroad tracks that cut through its heart, but by invisible lines drawn between the established families who'd founded the mill and the immigrant workers who kept it running. At the center of it all stood James Montgomery, owner of the Pine Haven lumber mill, a third-generation timber baron whose grandfather had built the mill with his own hands. To some, he was a pillar of the community, to others a symbol of everything wrong with the American dream. The immigrant workers, mostly Polish and Swedish, they lived on the east side of town, worked the hardest jobs, made the least money. Montgomery, he kept cutting wages, saying it was the Depression, but people noticed he was still building onto his house. Montgomery's Victorian mansion stood on Hill Street, overlooking both the mill and the workers' quarters, a daily reminder of the divide between those who owned Pine Haven and those who worked it. January 15th, 1935. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. The mill's night watchman, Eric Larson, was making his final rounds before the morning shift arrived. Eric Larson. I remember that morning clear as anything. The snow was falling heavy, could barely see 5 feet ahead. That's when I noticed something wasn't right about Mr. Montgomery's office window. Light was on, but it wasn't moving like a lantern would. What Eric Larson would discover in that office would shake Pine Haven to its core, exposing decades of buried secrets and testing the bonds of a community already stretched to its breaking point. At 5:43 a.m., Larson climbed the wooden stairs to Montgomery's office. The door was unlocked, unusual for a man known for his caution. Inside, first thing I saw was his desk chair, turned around facing the window. Thought maybe he'd fallen asleep working late. Then I noticed the blood. James Montgomery, age 52, had been murdered. A brass paperweight, a gift from his workers on the mill's 50th anniversary, lay beside him covered in blood. But this wasn't a simple case of worker violence, as some would quickly claim. The truth behind Montgomery's death would prove far more complex, reaching back decades into Pine Haven's history. To understand the murder that shook Pine Haven, we need to understand the forces that had been building in this small Wisconsin town for years. Forces that would eventually explode on that cold January morning in 1935. By sunrise on January 15, 1935, Pine Haven was alive with whispers. Police Chief Walter Drummond, a man who'd spent most of his career handling drunken disorderlies and petty theft, now faced the biggest case of his life.
When I got to the scene, seemed like half the town was already gathered outside the mill. Had to push through a crowd just to get to the office. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had someone to blame.
The murder scene told a violent story. Montgomery had been struck from behind while sitting at his desk, reviewing the previous day's production reports. The killing blow came from the brass paperweight, a cruel irony that wouldn't be lost on anyone. Detective notes. Victim struck 3 times. No signs of forced entry. Office safe untouched. Production ledger missing. Window slightly open despite cold. But it was what police found in Montgomery's desk that would crack the case wide open.
Bottom drawer was locked. Inside we found letters, dozens of them, going back 20 years. Someone had been threatening Montgomery for a long time.
The letters spoke of old debts, broken promises, and a dark secret from the mill's early days. One letter, dated just a week before the murder, was particularly chilling. Letter voice:
The truth can't stay buried forever, James. Like timber in a river, it always floats to the surface. Time to pay what's owed.
Meanwhile, in the Montgomery mansion on Hill Street, the victim's widow, Eleanor Montgomery, painted a picture of a troubled man in his final days.
James hadn't been sleeping, kept checking the locks, looking out windows, said something about old ghosts coming back to haunt us. I thought it was just the stress of running the mill during these hard times.
The initial investigation focused on the immigrant workers, particularly those who'd recently faced wage cuts. But Stefan Kowalski, the mill's foreman for 15 years, saw something others missed.
Montgomery wasn't just checking production reports that night. He was looking for something in the old records, something from back when his father ran the mill. He'd been in the records room for days.
The missing ledger covered the years 1912 to 1914, a period of rapid expansion for the mill, but also a time of tragedy. 3 workers had died in what was officially ruled an accident, but whispers of negligence and cover-ups had persisted for decades. As Chief Drummond dug deeper, he discovered that all 3 dead workers had been connected to a man named Victor Novak, a former business partner of Montgomery's father who'd vanished in 1914, leaving behind a wife and young son. Chief Drummond:
That's when things started making sense. The threatening letters, the missing ledger, Montgomery's paranoia. This wasn't about wage cuts or labor disputes. This was about something that happened 20 years ago, something worth killing for.
But as the investigation would soon reveal, the truth behind James Montgomery's murder reached far beyond a decades-old accident. It was a story of betrayal, hidden fortunes, and a debt that could only be paid in blood. As Pine Haven prepared to bury one of its most prominent citizens, no one suspected that the killer was about to make another move, one that would expose secrets some families had kept buried for generations. To understand the murder of James Montgomery, we must return to Pine Haven as it stood in 1912. The lumber industry was booming, and the Montgomery mill was about to undergo its biggest expansion yet. William Montgomery, James's father, had partnered with Victor Novak, a brilliant engineer from Prague, to modernize the mill. Novak had designed a revolutionary new saw system that would double production.
The Novak-Montgomery partnership was the talk of the Wisconsin lumber industry. 2 brilliant minds combining old money with new innovation, but success has a way of breeding both pride and paranoia.
The trouble began in March 1913. 3 workers died within 6 months, all while operating Novak's new machinery. March 15, 1913, Joseph Petrak. June 22, 1913, Anders Larson. September 4, 1913, Michael O'Reilly.
My father knew something wasn't right with those machines, told Mr. Novak they needed more safety features. Last thing he ever did was try to prove it.
Victor Novak had documented all his concerns about the machinery's safety, but these reports never reached the state inspectors. Instead, they vanished, along with crucial pages from the mill's ledger. William Montgomery claimed the deaths were tragic accidents, the price of progress, but Victor Novak disagreed. Their partnership began to crumble.
Strange transactions started showing up, large sums moving between accounts. Mr. Novak was convinced the mill's profits weren't being properly shared.
Then in January 1914, Victor Novak disappeared. His wife Maria was told he'd abandoned them, fled back to Europe. She was left penniless with a 5-year-old son.
Looking at the old case file, something jumped out. Nobody ever saw Novak leave town. No train tickets, no witnesses. He just vanished.
That spring, William Montgomery began a major renovation of the mill's foundation. The work was done quickly, mostly at night, by workers brought in from out of town. When our team brought modern scanning equipment to the site, we discovered something disturbing beneath the mill's foundation.
We found human remains, male around 40 years old, and with them a Prague Technical University ring, the same kind Victor Novak wore in every photograph we had of him.
My husband would never abandon his family. He would never leave without his ring. That ring was his pride, his connection to the old country.
Victor's son, Anton Novak, was raised believing his father had abandoned them. He grew up working odd jobs around Pine Haven, watching the Montgomery family prosper while his mother took in laundry to survive. By 1935, Anton Novak was 26 years old, working as a bookkeeper in Madison. He had his father's mind for numbers, and he had begun to piece together the truth about what happened in 1914.
The handwriting analysis was conclusive. The threatening letters sent to James Montgomery came from Anton Novak. He had discovered his father's old safety reports, hidden in the city archives.
On that fatal January night, James Montgomery had finally agreed to meet with Anton Novak, but he wasn't planning to make amends. In his safe, police would later find a train ticket to Canada and a new passport. What happened in that office wasn't just about a son avenging his father. It was about 20 years of lies, theft, and murder, a debt that had finally come due. The final hours of James Montgomery's life began with a knock on his office door. The mill was quiet, save for the distant hum of the night shift's skeleton crew.
Anton Novak. I brought everything I'd found, the hidden safety reports, the missing ledger pages, bank records showing how they'd cheated my father out of his share, and something else, a letter my father wrote the night he disappeared.
Veg Tivor's letter. My dearest Maria, if anything happens to me, know that William Montgomery has stolen everything. The patents, the profits, even the safety modifications that could have saved those men. I'm meeting him tonight to demand justice.
According to Anton Novak's later confession, James Montgomery didn't deny anything. Instead, he revealed an even darker truth.
Your father threatened to expose everything, not just the stolen patents and profits. He discovered that my father had been deliberately using faulty equipment to claim insurance money on accident victims, workers' lives traded for cash payouts.
Young James Montgomery, then just 31, had been the one keeping the books, falsifying documents, helping his father hide the evidence. But he hadn't known about the plan for Victor Novak.
I thought father would just buy him out, threaten him maybe. I didn't know. Not until I heard the struggle in the office that night. By then it was too late.
He offered me money, as if that could make up for 20 years of lies. For my mother working herself to death, believing she'd been abandoned. For 3 families who never knew why their loved ones really died.
The paperweight sat on Montgomery's desk, the same one given to him by the workers on the mill's 50th anniversary. Anton hadn't come planning to kill, but when Montgomery reached for the telephone, 3 blows, first one from behind, just like his father had done to Victor Novak. Poetic justice, Anton called it. Anton Novak walked out of the office at midnight. He turned himself in to Chief Drummond the next evening, carrying a leather briefcase full of evidence. The trial that followed rocked Wisconsin's lumber industry. Anton Novak was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, after the full story emerged. He served 8 years. The investigation led to major reforms in mill safety regulations. 3 families received posthumous compensation. The truth about Victor Novak finally came to light.
Some say the mill's haunted, that on quiet nights you can hear the old machinery running, the ghosts of those who died, still trying to warn others about the dangers nobody heeded.
Eleanor Montgomery sold the mill and moved east, unable to live with her family's legacy. The mansion was converted into a historical museum where Victor Novak's story is now prominently displayed. Anton Novak returned to Pine Haven after his release. He used his father's recovered patents to start a machinery safety consulting firm, helping prevent the kind of tragedies that had claimed so many lives.
My father used to say that progress without conscience is just another form of violence. It took 20 years, but finally, people understood what he meant.
Today, a memorial stands in Pine Haven Cemetery, honoring the 4 men who died in the pursuit of profit. Their stories serve as a reminder that the price of silence is always paid in blood. Pine Haven today bears little resemblance to the lumber town of 1935. The old mill, now a historical site, stands as a silent witness to a story that changed not just a town, but an entire industry.
What happened here wasn't unique to Pine Haven. Across America, immigrant workers were dying in industrial accidents, their stories buried in company ledgers. The Montgomery case just happened to be the one where the truth finally came out.
The ripples from the Montgomery murder spread far beyond Wisconsin. The case became a rallying cry for industrial safety reform. Headlines: Wisconsin mill murder exposes industry-wide corruption. Congress debates new safety regulations. Lumber industry faces widespread investigations.
Before Pine Haven, mill owners could brush off accidents as the cost of doing business. After, they faced real scrutiny, real consequences. The Montgomery case showed that the truth could no longer stay buried.
The families of Josef Petrak, Anders Larson, and Michael O'Reilly didn't just receive compensation. Their stories became part of labor history, taught in universities as a turning point in American industrial relations. The case exposed how immigrant workers were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. It became a catalyst for stronger union organization in the lumber industry. But perhaps the most profound changes happened in Pine Haven itself. The town's divide between established families and immigrant workers began to heal.
After the truth came out, people started seeing each other differently. Wasn't about old money versus immigrants anymore. Was about right and wrong. About justice.
Anton Novak's safety consulting firm grew into one of the largest in the Midwest. By the 1950s, it was setting industry standards for mill safety.
Every training session begins with the Pine Haven story. It reminds us that safety regulations are written in blood. Each rule exists because someone somewhere paid the ultimate price.
The Montgomery Mansion, now the Pine Haven Historical Society, houses a permanent exhibit called Voices of the Mill. It features recordings of mill workers' descendants sharing their families' stories.
Hearing their voices, their accents, it makes it real. These weren't just statistics in some old ledger. They were people with dreams, families, futures.
Today's lumber industry bears little resemblance to the dangerous mills of the 1930s. Automated systems and strict safety protocols have replaced the hazardous conditions that once claimed so many lives. Yet the lessons of Pine Haven remain relevant. In an era of global industry and corporate power, the story of 4 immigrants who died seeking the American dream still resonates. The mill still stands, the mansion still watches over the town, and in Pine Haven Cemetery, 4 graves remind us that progress without conscience carries a terrible price. Some say the ghosts of Pine Haven's past have finally found peace, but their story lives on, a warning and a promise, that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the light.
My father used to say that justice is like a river. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually, it finds its way through. Pine Haven taught us that, and we do well to remember it.
Time has a way of revealing truth, like rings in a tree stump telling the story of years past. The Pine Haven murder of 1935 left its own rings of truth, expanding outward through generations. People ask if I regret what happened that night. I regret that it had to end in violence, but I don't regret exposing the truth. Some debts can only be paid with justice. Today, every safety inspection in Wisconsin's lumber industry begins with a ritual, touching the brass paperweight that killed James Montgomery, now displayed in the state's Industrial Safety Museum. We call it Remembering Pine Haven. Before checking a single machine, we remind ourselves why these inspections matter. Every rule we enforce might save a father, a son, a husband. The descendants of those involved took different paths. The Montgomery family scattered across the country, many changing their name to escape the legacy. The Novak family built something different from their legacy. One of the largest workplace safety consultation firms in America, with offices in 12 countries. The families of Joseph Petrak, Anders Larson, and Michael O'Reilly remained in Pine Haven. Their grandchildren serve on the town's Historical Society board, ensuring their story is never forgotten.
The Pine Haven case remains relevant today. In every factory, every workplace where profit meets safety, we face the same fundamental questions. What price are we willing to pay for progress?
From Bangladesh garment factories to Chinese electronics plants, the echoes of Pine Haven's story continue. Different nations, different industries, same struggles. In Pine Haven schools, the cases required reading, not just as local history, but as a lesson in moral courage. What amazes me most isn't just the crime or the cover-up. It's how many people had to stay silent for 20 years, how many knew something was wrong but looked the other way. Our town's darkest chapter became its greatest lesson. Today, Pine Haven isn't known for the murder. We're known for what came after, how a community chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience. The old mill still stands, its wooden bones creaking with memories. The mansion still watches over the town, but they're no longer symbols of division. They're reminders of where we came from and why we must remain vigilant. In the end, the Pine Haven murder mystery wasn't just about who killed James Montgomery. It was about the price of progress, the cost of silence, and the power of truth to reach across generations. Anton Novak died in 1990, having spent more years fighting for worker safety than his father lived on this earth. His epitaph reads simply, "The truth will out."
Some call it a murder story.
others a labor rights milestone. But at its heart, Pine Haven is a uniquely American tale about immigrants and industry, progress and power, silence and justice.
They say on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the wind blows just right, you can still hear the old mill whisper its secrets. Not ghost stories, but something more important. Reminders of what happens when we choose profit over people, silence over truth. The sun rises over Pine Haven now, much as it did that fateful morning in 1935. The town has changed. The industry has changed. But the lesson remains, carved deep as tree rings in the heart of this community. Justice, like truth, may sleep but never dies, and some debts can only be paid in the currency of conscience.